The morning sun cast long shadows across the small town of Cedar Falls as Maria Rodriguez stepped out of her rental car. She wore simple jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and worn sneakers. Her dark hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she carried herself with quiet confidence despite her unassuming appearance. To anyone watching, she looked like any other woman stopping for breakfast during a road trip. Maria had been driving for 3 hours already. She was on her way to Fort Hamilton, where she would take command as the youngest female general in the Army's history. At 38, she had earned this position through years of dedication, sacrifice, and exceptional leadership. But today, she just wanted to grab a cup of coffee and a quiet meal before the whirlwind of her new assignment began. The Chrome Diner sat on Main Street like a throwback to another era. Its silver exterior gleamed in the morning light, and neon signs promised best coffee in town and home cooking like mama's. Maria pushed through the glass doors, hearing the familiar chime of the bell overhead. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, making her stomach growl. She had skipped breakfast in her eagerness to get on the road early. The diner was busy with the morning crowd. Local workers grabbed quick breakfasts before heading to their jobs. A few elderly men sat at the counter, solving the world's problems over bottomless cups of coffee. Families with children occupied the larger booths, and truck drivers hunched over hearty meals at tables near the windows. Maria scanned the room and spotted an empty booth in the back corner. Perfect. She could eat in peace and review some documents before continuing her journey. As she made her way through the maze of tables, she noticed a group of young soldiers in uniform sitting near the front. They wore the distinctive patches of the 82nd Airborne Division and appeared to be on leave or returning from training. The soldiers were loud and animated, clearly enjoying their freedom from military discipline. Maria recognized the type immediately. Young, confident, and probably thinking they owned the world. She had been like that once, fresh out of West Point and convinced she could conquer any challenge. Time and experience had taught her humility, but these boys were still learning that lesson. As Maria approached their table, one of the soldiers stood up abruptly. He was tall and muscular, with close-cropped hair and the swagger of someone who had never been truly challenged. His name tag read Jackson, and he wore the stripes of a sergeant. He had been gesturing wildly while telling a story to his companions and didn't see Maria approaching from behind. Jackson spun around quickly, his elbow catching Maria in the shoulder. The impact sent her stumbling backward, and she had to grab the back of a nearby chair to keep from falling. Her small purse scattered its contents across the floor, and conversations around them momentarily stopped. "Watch where you're going, lady," Jackson snapped without looking at her properly. He seemed more annoyed at being interrupted than concerned about what had happened. "This is a public place. You can't just sneak up behind people." Maria bent down to collect her belongings, her jaw tight with controlled anger. She had dealt with disrespectful soldiers before, but it never got easier. The young sergeant's attitude reminded her of every obstacle she had faced during her climb through the ranks. Every time someone had assumed she didn't belong in uniform. Every meeting where her voice was ignored until a male colleague repeated her exact words. "I'm sorry," Maria said calmly, standing up with her purse. "I was just trying to get to that booth back there." Jackson finally looked at her properly, his eyes scanning her civilian clothes with obvious dismissal. "Yeah, well, maybe try saying excuse me next time. We're trying to have a conversation here." His buddies laughed and nodded in agreement. One of them, a private with acne scars and nervous energy, spoke up. "Civilians don't understand military bearing, Sarge. They're not used to people who actually serve their country." The comment hit Maria like a physical blow. She had served her country for 20 years. She had led soldiers in combat, made life and death decisions, and earned the respect of her peers through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication. But to these young men, she was just another civilian who didn't matter. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Beth who had worked at the diner for 15 years, approached with coffee pot in hand. She had witnessed the entire exchange and looked uncomfortable. "Is everything okay over here?" "Everything's fine," Jackson said dismissively. "Just a little collision. No harm, no foul." Beth looked at Maria with concern. "Are you hurt, honey? That looked like a pretty hard bump." I'm okay, Maria replied, though her shoulder ached where Jackson's elbow had connected. These things happen. Jackson turned back to his table, clearly considering the matter closed. His friends resumed their conversation, laughing about something one of them had done during their last training exercise. They spoke loudly about their accomplishments, their toughness, and their plans for the weekend. Maria stood there for a moment, invisible to them despite being just a few feet away. The diner's other customers had returned to their meals and conversations. The incident was already forgotten by everyone except Maria. She walked to her chosen booth and slid into the worn vinyl seat, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to march back over there and give those soldiers a piece of her mind. Another part wanted to simply flash her military ID and watch their faces change. But Maria had learned long ago that respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. And sometimes, the best way to handle disrespect was to rise above it. She had bigger battles to fight than correcting the ignorance of a few young soldiers in a small-town diner. Beth appeared at her table with a menu and a sympathetic smile. I'm really sorry about that, hon. Some people just don't have any manners. Can I start you off with some coffee? Please, Maria said, grateful for the kindness. And maybe some aspirin if you have any. Of course. That was quite a knock you took. Beth poured steaming coffee into a white ceramic mug. Those boys think they're hot stuff because they're in uniform. But wearing a uniform and being a real soldier are two different things, if you ask me. Maria smiled at the waitress's wisdom. You're absolutely right about that. As Beth walked away to get the aspirin, Maria opened the folder she had brought with her. Inside were briefings about her new command, personnel files of her key staff members, and reports on current operations. She had read everything multiple times, but she wanted to be completely prepared for her first day. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. In less than 24 hours, she would be in command of thousands of soldiers just like the ones who had dismissed her so casually. Some of them might even be under her eventual authority if their units were ever reassigned. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but instead it made her feel tired. Maria had always known that her journey to the top would be difficult. Being a woman in the military meant proving herself over and over again. Every promotion had been scrutinized more carefully than those of her male counterparts. Every mistake had been magnified while her successes were often attributed to luck or politics rather than skill. She remembered her first assignment as a second lieutenant, fresh out of West Point with her mechanical engineering degree. Her platoon sergeant, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of experience, had looked her up and down on that first day and said, "Well, I guess they'll give bars to anyone these days." It had taken months to earn that sergeant's respect. She had worked harder than anyone else, studied every manual, and never asked for special treatment. Eventually, he became one of her strongest supporters. But the memory of that initial dismissal still stung, even after all these years. The soldiers at the front table were getting louder. Jackson was telling a story about a training exercise where his unit had performed exceptionally well. He described tactical maneuvers and leadership decisions with the confidence of someone who had never faced real combat. His audience hung on every word, clearly impressed by his apparent expertise. Maria listened with growing amusement. She recognized the exercise he was describing. It was a standard training scenario used at multiple bases, and she had observed it dozens of times as an instructor and evaluator. Jackson's version of events was dramatically embellished, with himself playing the role of tactical genius who had saved the day. In reality, Maria knew that particular exercise was designed to teach young leaders about the importance of communication and adaptability. Most units struggled with it initially, which was the entire point. The fact that Jackson thought his performance had been exceptional suggested he had missed the real lessons entirely. Beth returned with the aspirin and a glass of water. Here you go, honey. Have you decided what you'd like to eat? Maria realized she hadn't even looked at the menu. What would you recommend? The breakfast special is really good. 2 eggs any style, bacon or sausage, hash browns, and toast. It's what most folks order. That sounds perfect. Over easy on the eggs, bacon, and wheat toast if you have it. Coming right up. Beth hesitated for a moment. You know, I've been working here for 15 years, and I can usually tell a lot about people just by watching them. You handled that situation with a lot more grace than those boys deserved. There's something different about you. Maria looked up from her coffee, curious. Different how? Well, you've got that quiet confidence that comes from real experience. Not the loud, flashy kind that needs everyone to notice. The kind that just is. Beth glanced toward the soldiers' table. Those boys are all talk and swagger. You've got the real thing. The waitress's perceptiveness surprised Maria. Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. After Beth left, Maria returned to her documents, but her concentration was broken by continued noise from the soldiers' table. They had moved on to criticizing various aspects of military life, from the food to their officers to what they saw as excessive regulations. The problem with the Army today, Jackson was saying loudly, is too much political correctness. They're more worried about hurt feelings than fighting capability. Back in the day, soldiers were tough. Now they coddle everyone. His friends nodded in agreement. The private with the acne scars added, and don't get me started on all these diversity programs. We should promote people based on ability, not checking boxes. Maria's grip tightened on her coffee mug. These young soldiers had no idea what they were talking about. They had never served under a diverse leadership team or witnessed firsthand how different perspectives and backgrounds strengthen military effectiveness. Their narrow worldview was exactly the kind of thinking that held the military back from reaching its full potential. She thought about the countless talented soldiers she had known over the years who had been overlooked or underutilized because they didn't fit traditional expectations. Women who were brilliant strategists but were steered toward support roles. Minority soldiers whose insights were dismissed. People whose potential was wasted because of outdated attitudes and assumptions. The conversation at Jackson's table grew more animated. They were now discussing their weekend plans, which apparently involved drinking heavily and trying to impress local women with their military status. Their sense of entitlement was palpable, and Maria found herself wondering how they would react to taking orders from someone they perceived as beneath them. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her aide-de-camp, Major Sarah Chun, confirming your arrival tomorrow at 0800. Press conference scheduled for 1000. Looking forward to working with you, General. Maria smiled as she typed back, see you then. Ready to get started. The title General still felt new to her, even though the promotion had been official for 2 months. She had spent the time since then, transitioning from her previous assignment and preparing for this new challenge. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of what she hoped would be the most important phase of her career. As she waited for her breakfast, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 20 years ago, she had been not much older than the soldiers sitting nearby. She had been just as confident and probably just as ignorant about many things. The difference was that she had been lucky enough to serve under leaders who challenged her assumptions and helped her grow. Her first commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Williams, had been a trailblazer in her own right. She had taught Maria that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or demanding respect through intimidation. True leadership came from competence, integrity, and the ability to inspire others to achieve more than they thought possible. The best leaders, Colonel Williams had once told her, are often the ones who don't look like what people expect. They succeed not in spite of being different, but because of it. Your perspective matters, Rodriguez. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. Beth arrived with Maria's breakfast, the plate laden with perfectly cooked eggs, crispy bacon, and golden hash browns. There you go, Han, enjoy. The food was excellent, exactly the kind of hearty meal she needed before continuing her drive. As she ate, Maria continued to half-listen to the soldiers' conversation while reviewing her notes. She made mental plans for her first week as general, thinking about the meetings she would need to have and the priorities she wanted to establish. The soldiers were now discussing their opinions about military leadership in general terms that made Maria wince. Their understanding of command responsibility was superficial at best, focused more on the perks of rank than the weight of responsibility that came with it. They talked about, when they became officers, as if it were an inevitable promotion rather than a challenging transition that required years of preparation and growth. Jackson, clearly the informal leader of the group, was particularly vocal about his future plans. I'm thinking about going to OCS after my current enlistment, he announced. The Army needs more officers who understand what it's like to be a real soldier. Too many of these college boys get commissioned without ever doing the hard work. His comment revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the officer development process. Maria had served alongside outstanding officers who had come up through the enlisted ranks, and she had enormous respect for their experience and perspective. But she had also seen how some people used that background as an excuse to resist new ideas or dismiss the value of formal education and training. The most effective officers, in her experience, were those who combined practical experience with intellectual curiosity and continuous learning. They understood that leadership was a skill that had to be developed over time, not something that came automatically with promotion or attitude. As Maria finished her breakfast, she noticed an elderly man at a nearby table watching the soldiers with obvious disapproval. He wore a veteran's cap and moved with the careful deliberation of someone dealing with old injuries. When their eyes met, he shook his head slightly and mouthed, "Kids these days." Maria smiled and nodded in understanding. Every generation of veterans probably felt the same way about the newcomers. She remembered older soldiers making similar comments about her generation when she was starting out. It was a natural cycle, but it also highlighted the importance of mentorship and leadership development. The check arrived, and Maria paid quickly, eager to get back on the road. She had another 2 hours of driving ahead of her, and she wanted to arrive with enough time to settle into her temporary quarters before the official activities began tomorrow. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Jackson's voice carried across the diner once again. He was now expounding on military strategy in the Middle East, offering solutions to complex geopolitical problems with the confidence of someone who had never actually been responsible for implementing policy or dealing with the consequences of strategic decisions. Maria stood up and walked toward the exit, passing close to their table. For a moment, she considered stopping to engage them in conversation. She could have shared some real insights about leadership, strategy, and the complexities of modern military operations. But she knew it would be pointless. They weren't ready to listen, and she had more important things to focus on. Jackson didn't even look up as she passed. He was too busy holding court for his audience, secure in his belief that his opinions were both important and correct. His friends continued to nod and laugh at appropriate moments, feeding his ego and reinforcing his sense of superiority. At the door, Maria turned back for one last look at the scene. In less than 24 hours, she would be addressing a room full of senior officers, outlining her vision for her new command, and beginning the challenging work of leadership at the highest levels. These young soldiers would continue their journey through the ranks, hopefully learning and growing along the way. She wondered if any of them would remember this morning years from now, when they were older and perhaps wiser. Would Jackson look back and cringe at his arrogance? Would he learn to appreciate perspectives different from his own? Would any of them become the kind of leaders who lifted others up rather than putting them down? The morning air was crisp and clean as Maria walked to her car. She had parked next to a large pickup truck with multiple military-themed bumper stickers and a PALMIA flag hanging from the antenna. The contrast between the vehicle's proud display of military support and the behavior she had just witnessed inside the diner was not lost on her. As she started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, Maria felt a familiar sense of determination settling over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but today had reminded her why her work mattered. There were still too many Jacksons in the military, soldiers whose potential was limited by their narrow thinking and unwillingness to grow. But there were also countless others who were ready to learn, to adapt, and to become the leaders the military needed for the future. Those were the people she would focus on. Those were the ones who would help her transform not just her new command, but the entire institution. The road stretched ahead of her, leading toward Fort Hamilton and the next chapter of her career. In the rearview mirror, the chrome diner grew smaller and disappeared, but the memory of the morning's encounter would stay with her. It would serve as a reminder of how far she had come and how much work still needed to be done. Maria Rodriguez, soon to be General Rodriguez, drove toward her destiny with quiet confidence and unshakable resolve. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The gates of Fort Hamilton rose before Maria like steel sentinels guarding a small city. Military police checked her credentials with professional efficiency, their demeanor immediately shifting when they saw the orders designating her as the incoming commanding general. Within minutes, she was being escorted through the sprawling base by a convoy that included her new aide-de-camp, Major Sarah Chun, and the acting commander, Brigadier General Michael Harrison. Fort Hamilton housed nearly 15,000 soldiers across multiple units. Tank battalions, infantry regiments, support companies, and training facilities spread across thousands of acres. As Maria's convoy wound through the base, she observed everything with the trained eye of someone who had spent 2 decades learning to assess military readiness from countless small details. The base looked good. Soldiers moved with purpose, equipment appeared well-maintained, and the facilities showed signs of proper care and investment. But Maria knew that surface appearances could be deceiving. Real leadership was revealed in crisis situations, under pressure, and in the daily decisions that shaped culture and morale. The change of command ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 0800, Major Chin explained from the passenger seat. Full dress uniforms, honor guard, the works. The press will be there, along with several members of Congress and senior Pentagon officials. Maria nodded, reviewing the schedule on her tablet. What about the unit commanders meeting afterward? 1,000 hours in the main conference room, General Harrison replied from the seat beside her. All battalion and company commanders will be present. They're eager to meet you, ma'am. The phrase, eager to meet you, carried undertones that Maria recognized immediately. Some would genuinely be eager, curious about her leadership style and vision. Others would be skeptical, wondering if she had truly earned her position or if politics had played a role in her promotion. A few might even be openly resistant to taking orders from a woman, regardless of her qualifications. Maria had dealt with all these reactions before, though never at this level. Being the commanding general of a major installation was different from any previous assignment. Every decision she made would affect thousands of people. Every word would be scrutinized and analyzed. Every mistake would be magnified, especially by those looking for reasons to doubt her competence. Her temporary quarters were located in a quiet section of the base reserved for senior officers. The house was modest but comfortable, with a small office where she could work during the transition period. As her luggage was brought in, Maria found herself thinking about the soldiers she had encountered at the Chrome Diner that morning. The incident seemed almost trivial now, given everything else on her mind. But something about Jackson's attitude continued to bother her. It wasn't just his rudeness or arrogance. It was the casual dismissal, the automatic assumption that she didn't matter. She wondered how many other soldiers harbored similar attitudes, and what impact that might have on unit cohesion and effectiveness. Major Chin knocked on the door frame of Maria's temporary office. "General, I have the personnel files you requested, along with the latest readiness reports." "Thank you, Sarah. Come in and sit down." Maria gestured to a chair across from her desk. "I want to get your honest assessment of the command climate here. What should I know that won't be in the official reports?" Chin hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. The troops respect General Harrison, and morale is generally good. But there have been some concerning incidents lately. Nothing that reached crisis level, but patterns that suggest underlying issues. What kind of patterns? Discrimination complaints that were handled quietly rather than thoroughly investigated. Training incidents that should have resulted in more serious consequences. A few cases where soldiers felt their concerns weren't being taken seriously by their chain of command. Chin paused. There's also been some grumbling about the Army's diversity initiatives. Not universal, but present in certain units. Maria wasn't surprised. These issues existed throughout the military to varying degrees. The key was identifying the root causes and addressing them systematically rather than treating symptoms. Which units seem to have the most problems? 2nd Battalion, 75th Infantry Regiment, has had 3 EO complaints in the past 6 months. All were resolved at the unit level, but the pattern suggests leadership issues. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, is old school in his approach, meaning he believes in traditional military values and isn't particularly enthusiastic about what he sees as social engineering. He's competent tactically, but his soldiers either love him or fear him. There doesn't seem to be much middle ground. Maria made a note to prioritize a meeting with Morrison. Commanders who inspired either love or fear often created toxic environments, even if that wasn't their intention. Effective leadership required finding the balance between maintaining standards and treating soldiers with dignity and respect. The rest of the afternoon was spent in briefings and meetings. Maria met with key staff officers, reviewed operational plans, and began to get a feel for the personalities and dynamics that would shape her command. As evening approached, she found herself both excited and apprehensive about the challenges ahead. Dinner was a quiet affair in the officers' club, where she was introduced to several dozen senior officers and their spouses. The conversations were polite but guarded, with everyone trying to make a good first impression while also sizing up their new commander. Maria recognized the careful dance of military politics and played her part gracefully. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was among the officers present, and Maria made a point of speaking with him briefly. He was exactly what she had expected based on Chin's description. A career infantry officer in his mid-40s with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent most of his adult life in the field. His handshake was firm, his manner respectful, but cool. "Looking forward to working with you, General," Morrison said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "The 75th is ready for anything you might throw at us." "I'm sure they are, Colonel. I'd like to visit your unit sometime next week. Get a feel for how things operate at the ground level." Morrison's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, ma'am. We'll be ready for your inspection." "Not an inspection, Colonel. Just a conversation. I learn more from talking to soldiers than from formal presentations." Maria smiled. "I assume you feel the same way?" "Absolutely, ma'am." Morrison's reply came a beat too late, suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with informal interaction between ranks. As Maria mingled with other officers, she overheard fragments of conversations that gave her additional insight into the command climate. Most discussions were professional and appropriate, but she noticed that certain topics seemed to generate more passionate responses than others. Near the bar, a group of company commanders were discussing a recent training exercise. Their conversation was animated but good-natured until someone mentioned new regulations regarding equal opportunity and harassment prevention. "It's getting ridiculous," one captain complained. "We spend more time in sensitivity training than we do on actual combat skills. How are we supposed to prepare soldiers for war when we're worried about offending someone?" "Come on, Pete," another officer replied. "It's not that bad. Most of this stuff is just common sense anyway. Treat people with respect, maintain professional standards. We should have been doing it all along." "Easy for you to say. Your unit doesn't have any problem soldiers. I've got 3 guys who file complaints every time someone looks at them wrong. The paperwork alone takes up half my time." Maria made a mental note to review the complaint procedures and statistics. If soldiers were filing frivolous complaints, that needed to be addressed. But she also knew that complaints were often symptoms of deeper leadership failures. Soldiers who felt genuinely respected and valued rarely felt the need to file formal grievances. The evening wound down gradually, with officers departing to prepare for the next day's ceremony. Maria returned to her quarters and spent the final hours before sleep reviewing her remarks for the change of command ceremony. She wanted to strike the right tone, confident but not arrogant, decisive but not inflexible. The speech was important, but Maria knew that her real test would come in the days and weeks that followed. Ceremonies were symbolic gestures that marked transitions. Real change happened through daily decisions, consistent leadership, and the gradual building of trust and respect. She fell asleep thinking about Jackson and his friends at the diner. By now, they were probably back at their own base, perhaps bragging to other soldiers about their weekend adventures. They had no idea that their casual dismissal of a civilian woman had actually been directed at someone who would soon outrank every soldier they had ever met. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so representative of broader problems in military culture. How many other talented individuals were being overlooked or undervalued because they didn't fit traditional expectations? How many potential leaders were being discouraged by attitudes like Jackson's? Dawn came early at Fort Hamilton, with reveille sounding across the base at 0530. Maria was already awake, having maintained the military habit of rising before sunrise regardless of the previous day's schedule. She dressed carefully in her best dress uniform, checking every detail twice. Today's ceremony would be her first public appearance as a commanding general, and first impressions mattered enormously. The parade ground filled with soldiers as the morning progressed. Hundreds of men and women in crisp dress uniforms formed precise formations, their movements synchronized through countless hours of drill practice. Honor guards took their positions, flags unfurled in the morning breeze, and a military band prepared to provide ceremonial music. Maria stood in the staging area, receiving final briefings from her staff while observing the crowd that had gathered for the ceremony. Local dignitaries, family members, and soldiers from throughout the base filled bleachers and standing areas. Television cameras captured everything for broadcast and official records. Congressman Robert Walsh approached her with an aide in tow. He was a member of the House Armed Services Committee and had been instrumental in supporting her promotion. General Rodriguez, congratulations on this historic achievement. The first Latina commanding general of a major installation. It's a significant milestone. Thank you, Congressman. I prefer to focus on being the best commanding general I can be, regardless of demographics. Maria's response was diplomatic but firm. She understood the importance of representation, but she didn't want to be defined solely by her ethnicity or gender. Of course. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Your record speaks for itself. Walsh seemed slightly flustered by her response. I just think it's important to recognize progress when we see it. At precisely 0800, the ceremony began. General Harrison delivered his farewell remarks, reflecting on his time as acting commander and expressing confidence in the future. His speech was gracious and professional, setting a positive tone for the transition. When Maria stepped to the podium to deliver her acceptance remarks, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. She looked out at hundreds of faces, soldiers who would be under her command, family members who shared their burdens, and officials who would be watching her performance closely. Today marks not just a change in command, but a reaffirmation of our commitment to excellence. Maria began. Excellence in training, in readiness, and in how we treat one another as members of the profession of arms. She spoke for 10 minutes, outlining her expectations and vision without being overly specific or prescriptive. The key was to establish her authority while making it clear that she valued input and collaboration. She wanted soldiers to understand that she would hold them to high standards while also supporting their professional and personal growth. Leadership is not about rank or position, Maria concluded. It's about service. Service to our nation, to our mission, and to each other. Together, we will ensure that Fort Hamilton continues to be a place where excellence is not just expected, but achieved. The applause was respectful and sustained, though Maria knew that real acceptance would take time and would be measured by actions rather than words. Ceremonies created opportunities, but leadership had to be proven through daily performance. After the formal conclusion of the ceremony, Maria spent 30 minutes greeting soldiers and family members in a receiving line. Most interactions were brief and positive, with soldiers expressing enthusiasm about serving under her command. But she also noticed a few individuals who seemed less enthusiastic, offering perfunctory congratulations while avoiding eye contact. One young sergeant approached with obvious nervousness. His name tag read Williams, and he couldn't have been more than 22 years old. General, ma'am, I just wanted to say that my whole unit is excited about the new leadership. We're ready to work hard and make you proud. Thank you, Sergeant Williams. What's your MLS? Maria asked, referring to his military occupational specialty. Signal intelligence, ma'am. I work in the communications center. Critical work. Good communications can mean the difference between success and failure in any operation. Maria's genuine interest seemed to surprise and please the young soldier. Yes, ma'am. I won't let you down. As Williams moved on, Maria reflected on the difference between his enthusiasm and Jackson's arrogance from the previous morning. Both were young soldiers, but their attitudes toward leadership and service were completely different. Williams saw his role as supporting the mission and his leaders. Jackson seemed to view the military primarily as a platform for demonstrating his own superiority. The receiving line continued with a steady stream of well-wishers and introductions. Maria made an effort to remember names and faces, knowing that personal connections would be crucial to her success as a leader. Soldiers needed to feel valued as individuals, not just as resources to be managed and deployed. Near the end of the line, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison approached with his wife. He introduced her politely and made appropriate small talk about the ceremony and the weather. But Maria sensed an underlying tension in his demeanor that hadn't been present during their brief conversation the previous evening. "Colonel, I'm looking forward to that visit to your unit next week," Maria said. "What day would work best for your schedule?" "Any day is fine, General. We're always ready for command visits." Morrison's response was correct, but seemed rehearsed. "Excellent. Let's make it Tuesday afternoon. I'd like to observe a training exercise and then talk with some of your soldiers informally." Morrison nodded, but his wife suddenly spoke up. "General, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but my husband is the finest officer I've ever known. His soldiers would follow him anywhere, and he's never received anything but outstanding evaluations." The comment caught Maria off guard, not because of its content, but because of its timing and defensive tone. Mrs. Morrison seemed to be preemptively defending her husband against some perceived threat or criticism. "I'm sure that's true," Maria replied diplomatically. "I look forward to seeing his unit in action." As the Morrisons moved away, Maria wondered what had prompted the wife's unsolicited testimonial. Was Morrison feeling insecure about his position under new command? Had there been discussions at home about potential changes or challenges? Or was the defensive response simply a reflection of broader anxiety about how the transition might affect career prospects? The official reception that followed the ceremony provided additional opportunities for observation and assessment. Maria circulated among groups of officers and their families, listening more than speaking and trying to identify the informal networks and relationships that shaped base culture. She overheard several conversations that reinforced her earlier impression that certain topics were particularly contentious. References to political correctness, diversity quotas, and social engineering appeared frequently, usually in the context of complaints about changing military policies and procedures. One group of field-grade officers was particularly vocal in their criticism of recent Army initiatives. "The problem is that we're trying to be all things to all people," complained a major whose name tag identified him as Thompson. "We've lost focus on our primary mission, fighting and winning wars." "I don't disagree with equal opportunity in principle," added a lieutenant colonel. "But when we start lowering standards to meet quotas, we're putting lives at risk. Combat doesn't care about diversity statistics." Maria recognized the arguments because she had heard variations of them throughout her career. There were legitimate concerns about maintaining standards and ensuring that all soldiers were properly prepared for their duties. But, too often, these discussions became excuses for resisting change and maintaining the status quo. The conversation continued with increasingly pointed comments about social experiments and politically motivated policies. Maria realized that some officers viewed her own promotion through this lens, seeing her selection as commanding general as part of a broader agenda rather than recognition of her qualifications and performance. As the reception began to wind down, Maria found herself in conversation with General Harrison and several senior staff officers. They discussed routine administrative matters and upcoming training schedules, but she could sense that everyone was still in assessment mode, trying to understand her leadership style and priorities. "General, do you have any immediate changes you'd like to implement?" asked the Chief of Staff, Colonel David Park. "Any policies or procedures you'd like us to review?" "Not yet, Colonel. I want to observe current operations and get input from soldiers at all levels before making significant changes." Good leaders listen before they act. The answer seemed to satisfy most of the group, but Maria noticed that Morrison remained silent throughout the discussion. His body language suggested discomfort or disagreement, though he was too professional to express it directly. As evening approached, Maria finally returned to her quarters to decompress and prepare for the first full week of her command. The day had gone well overall, with no major problems or concerning incidents. But she was already forming impressions about the challenges she would face in the coming months. The base was well-run and professionally competent, but there were clear undercurrents of resistance to change and skepticism about her leadership. Some of this was probably inevitable. Any new commander faced similar challenges regardless of their background or qualifications. But some of it seemed specifically related to her identity as a woman and a minority officer. Maria had always known that breaking barriers came with additional scrutiny and pressure. She would have to perform better than her male counterparts to receive the same level of respect and acceptance. Every mistake would be magnified. Every success would be questioned or attributed to favoritism. But she had not come this far by backing down from challenges or accepting lower standards for herself. Tomorrow would begin the real work of command, building relationships, solving problems, and proving that she deserved the trust that had been placed in her. As she reviewed her schedule for the coming week, Maria's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but unmistakable in its intent. "Congratulations on your promotion, General. Some of us remember when you knew your place. Enjoy it while it lasts." Maria stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a familiar mix of anger and determination. Anonymous threats were nothing new. She had received them periodically throughout her career, usually coinciding with promotions or high-profile assignments. But they still stung, particularly when they came on what should have been a day of celebration and achievement. She deleted the message without responding and made a note to inform base security about the incident. Whoever had sent it had probably intended to intimidate or discourage her, but the effect was exactly the opposite. It reminded her why her success mattered and why she could not afford to fail. The next morning would bring new challenges and opportunities. Maria Rodriguez was ready for both. Tuesday afternoon arrived with unseasonable warmth for late autumn. Maria drove herself to the 2nd Battalion's training area, declining the offer of an official escort. She wanted to observe Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unit in their natural environment, not during a carefully orchestrated show designed to impress visiting dignitaries. The training area sprawled across several thousand acres of rolling hills and dense forest. Tank trails crisscrossed the landscape, and the distant sound of artillery fire indicated that multiple units were conducting exercises simultaneously. Maria parked near a cluster of tactical vehicles and made her way toward the command post, where Morrison was supposedly observing his soldiers' training exercise. As she approached, Maria could hear raised voices coming from behind a camouflage shelter. She paused, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like a serious discussion between leaders. But the tone of the conversation made her increasingly uncomfortable as she listened. "I don't care what the new regulations say," Morrison's voice carried clearly in the afternoon air. "This is how we've always done things, and it works. I'm not changing my standards just because some politician in Washington decides we need to be more inclusive." Another voice, which Maria recognized as belonging to Major Kevin Torres, Morrison's executive officer, responded with obvious frustration. "Sir, with respect, the regulations aren't suggestions. They're direct orders from higher headquarters. We have to implement them. Do we?" Morrison's tone was contemptuous. "Or do we just have to appear to implement them? There's a difference between following the letter of the law and following the spirit. As long as we check the right boxes and file the right reports, nobody really cares what happens out here in the field." Maria felt her jaw tighten. Morrison was essentially advocating for deliberate noncompliance with lawful orders and regulations. This wasn't about maintaining high standards or protecting traditional military values. It was about actively undermining policies he disagreed with while maintaining plausible deniability. "Sir, I'm not comfortable with that approach," Torres replied. "Some of these policies are designed to protect soldiers and ensure equal treatment. If we ignore them, people could get hurt. People get hurt in war, Major. That's the nature of our business. What hurts us more is when we start treating the military like some kind of social services agency instead of a fighting force." Morrison's words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of modern military operations and leadership principles. Effective fighting forces were built on trust, mutual respect, and the confidence that all soldiers would be treated fairly regardless of their background. Units with poor internal cohesion and high levels of discrimination consistently performed worse in combat situations. Maria decided she had heard enough. She stepped around the shelter and into view of the two officers, who immediately snapped to attention when they saw her approach. General Rodriguez, Morrison said, his expression betraying no hint that he realized she might have overheard their conversation. Welcome to 2nd Battalion. We're conducting a combined arms exercise this afternoon. Tanks, infantry, and artillery working together in a simulated urban warfare environment. Thank you, Colonel. I'm looking forward to observing your soldiers in action. Maria's tone was neutral, but she made a mental note to follow up on the conversation she had overheard. Major Torres, good to see you again. Torres looked nervous but responded professionally. General, it's an honor to have you visit our unit. Morrison launched into a detailed briefing about the exercise objectives and parameters. He spoke with confidence and obvious knowledge of tactical principles, describing how his soldiers were practicing coordinated movements through simulated city streets while dealing with hostile forces and civilian populations. The key is maintaining operational tempo while minimizing collateral damage, Morrison explained. My soldiers understand that speed and violence of action are essential, but they also know how to show restraint when necessary. As they moved toward the observation point, Maria found herself genuinely impressed by what she saw. The soldiers of 2nd Battalion were clearly well-trained and disciplined. Their movements were coordinated and purposeful, their communication was crisp and professional, and they demonstrated excellent tactical awareness. Tank crews maneuvered their vehicles with skill and precision, working in close coordination with dismounted infantry soldiers who cleared buildings and secured intersections. Artillery support was delivered with pinpoint accuracy, and medical evacuation procedures were executed flawlessly when simulated casualties occurred. Your soldiers are performing exceptionally well, Colonel, Maria observed truthfully. Their technical proficiency is obvious, and their teamwork is excellent. Morrison's chest swelled with evident pride. Thank you, General. We train hard, and we maintain high standards. Every soldier in this battalion knows that excellence is the only acceptable option. Maria watched the exercise continue for another 30 minutes, taking notes and asking detailed questions about training procedures and performance metrics. Morrison's answers were knowledgeable and comprehensive, demonstrating his genuine expertise in tactical operations. But Maria was also observing interpersonal dynamics and leadership styles. She noticed that soldiers interacted differently with different leaders. Some officers and non-commissioned officers inspired obvious confidence and loyalty, while others seemed to generate more nervous compliance than genuine respect. She made a point of speaking directly with several soldiers during brief pauses in the exercise. Most were enthusiastic about their training and spoke positively about their leaders and unit cohesion. But a few responses suggested underlying tensions that weren't immediately apparent. Sergeant First Class Jennifer Martinez, a squad leader with 12 years of service, was particularly articulate about the battalion's strengths and weaknesses. The training is excellent, General. We're definitely prepared for whatever mission we might be given. But sometimes it feels like we're fighting two battles, one against the enemy and one against our own outdated attitudes. What do you mean by that, Sergeant? Maria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Martinez glanced around nervously before responding. Well, ma'am, some of the older leadership still doesn't really accept that women can do everything men can do. They follow the regulations because they have to, but you can tell they don't believe in them. It makes it harder for female soldiers to feel like they're really part of the team. Have you experienced this personally or observed it happening to others? Both, ma'am. Nothing that would hold up in a formal complaint, but lots of little things that add up over time. Comments about whether women belong in certain jobs, assumptions about our physical capabilities, subtle exclusion from informal leadership discussions. Maria nodded thoughtfully. Martinez was describing exactly the kind of environment that Morrison's earlier comments had suggested he was fostering. The battalion might be tactically proficient, but it wasn't maximizing the potential of all its soldiers. What would you like to see change, Sergeant? Honestly, General, I'd like to see leaders who judge soldiers based on performance instead of demographics. I'd like to know that my career will be based on what I accomplish, not on whether certain people think I belong here. Martinez paused. I love being a soldier, and I'm good at my job. I just want the same opportunities as everyone else. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. The exercise was concluding, and soldiers were beginning to gather for the after-action review that would analyze their performance and identify areas for improvement. Morrison called his soldiers together in a large circle and began the debriefing process. His analysis of the exercise was thorough and insightful, highlighting both successes and areas that needed work. He asked probing questions that demonstrated his understanding of complex tactical problems and his commitment to continuous improvement. The coordination between tanks and infantry was outstanding, Morrison told his assembled soldiers. But we need to work on our communication with the artillery forward observers. Timing is everything in combined operations, and we can't afford delays when we're requesting fire support. Soldiers nodded and took notes, clearly respecting their commander's expertise and judgment. Several offered their own observations and suggestions, creating the kind of open dialogue that characterized effective military units. But Maria also noticed what wasn't being discussed. There were no comments about individual soldiers who had performed exceptionally well, particularly if those soldiers happened to be women or minorities. The focus was entirely on technical procedures and tactical outcomes, with no acknowledgement of the human element that made everything possible. When the formal debriefing concluded, Morrison invited Maria to address his soldiers directly. She stood in front of the group, looking at the faces of men and women who represented the future of the Army. I want to thank you all for the privilege of observing your training today, Maria began. Your professionalism and competence are exactly what our nation expects from its soldiers, and you have clearly met those expectations. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But technical proficiency is only part of what makes a unit successful. The other part is trust, trust between soldiers, trust in leaders, and trust that every member of the team will be valued and supported. Maria could see Morrison shifting uncomfortably beside her, probably sensing where her comments were headed. The Army is changing, as it always has throughout its history. We face new challenges, new enemies, and new environments that require new approaches and new perspectives. The units that thrive will be those that embrace change and harness the full potential of every soldier, regardless of their background. The soldiers listened intently, some nodding in agreement, while others remained expressionless. Maria could sense the different reactions throughout the group and knew that her words were being interpreted through the lens of each individual's experiences and beliefs. Excellence is not about maintaining the status quo, she continued. It's about constantly improving, constantly adapting, and constantly raising the bar. I expect that from myself, from your leaders, and from each of you. When she finished speaking, the applause was respectful but not enthusiastic. Maria had delivered a message that challenged some fundamental assumptions about military culture and leadership, and she knew that not everyone was ready to hear it. As soldiers began to disperse and return to their barracks, Morrison approached Maria with a carefully neutral expression. Thank you for those remarks, General. My soldiers appreciated hearing from you directly. They're exceptional soldiers, Colonel. I hope they know how much their service means to the nation. I make sure they do, ma'am. Every day. As they walked back toward the parking area, Maria decided to address the conversation she had overheard earlier. Colonel, I'd like to schedule a private meeting with you sometime this week. There are some command policy issues I'd like to discuss. Morrison's step faltered slightly. Of course, General. My calendar is completely open to you. Good. Let's make it Thursday afternoon at 1500 hours. In my office. The drive back to base headquarters gave Maria time to process what she had observed and heard during the afternoon. Morrison's battalion was undeniably competent from a tactical standpoint. Their training was rigorous, their equipment was well maintained, and their soldiers performed their duties with skill and dedication. But there were clear problems beneath the surface. The conversation she had overheard suggested that Morrison was actively undermining policies he disagreed with, creating an environment where discrimination and exclusion could flourish unchecked. That was unacceptable regardless of how well his unit performed in training exercises. Maria also reflected on her conversation with Sergeant Martinez. The young leader's concerns were representative of what many soldiers faced daily. Subtle but persistent reminders that they didn't fully belong or weren't completely accepted by their peers and superiors. These issues weren't unique to Morrison's battalion or even to Fort Hamilton. They existed throughout the military and required sustained, systematic efforts to address. But, as commanding general, Maria had both the authority and the responsibility to set the tone for her entire installation. Back in her office, Maria asked Major Chin to pull Morrison's complete personnel file, including all evaluation reports, efficiency reports, and any complaints or commendations from the past 5 years. She wanted to understand the full picture before their Thursday meeting. She also requested statistics on equal opportunity complaints, disciplinary actions, and retention rates broken down by unit and demographic categories. If Morrison was creating a hostile environment for certain groups of soldiers, the data would reflect that pattern. As evening approached, Maria found herself thinking about the anonymous message she had received after the change of command ceremony. Whoever had sent it was probably someone like Morrison, a person who saw her promotion as illegitimate and her leadership as a threat to traditional military values. But Maria had not come this far by being intimidated or discouraged by people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. Every challenge was an opportunity to prove herself and to create positive change for the soldiers under her command. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was immediately familiar. General Rodriguez? This is Sergeant First Class Martinez. I hope you don't mind that I got your number from the command directory. Not at all, Sergeant. What can I do for you? Ma'am, I wanted to follow up on our conversation this afternoon. After you left, there was some discussion among the soldiers about what you said. Most of it was positive, but some people weren't happy about your comments regarding change and new approaches. Maria wasn't surprised. What kind of discussions, Sergeant? Well, some of the senior NCOs were saying that you're probably going to start pushing political agendas instead of focusing on military readiness. They think you're going to lower standards to accommodate people who can't meet the traditional requirements. And what do you think, Sergeant? Martinez was quiet for a moment before responding. I think you understand something that a lot of leaders don't, General. High standards and equal opportunity aren't opposites. They actually support each other. When you treat all soldiers fairly and give everyone a real chance to succeed, you end up with better overall performance. That's exactly right, Sergeant. And I'm going to need leaders like you to help make that understanding more widespread. I'm ready to help however I can, General. But I should warn you that there's going to be resistance. Some people have invested a lot in the current system and don't want to see it change. After the call ended, Maria sat in her office reviewing reports and planning for the coming days. She knew that the real test of her leadership was just beginning. The ceremony and formal meetings were symbolic gestures that established her authority. But changing culture and improving performance required sustained effort and unwavering commitment. Thursday's meeting with Morrison would be her first significant test. She needed to make it clear that undermining official policies was unacceptable while also finding a way to channel his obvious tactical competence in positive directions. But Morrison was just one piece of a larger puzzle. Creating lasting change required building coalitions of support among leaders at all levels, from senior officers to junior enlisted soldiers. It meant identifying and empowering people like Sergeant Martinez who shared her vision of what the military could become. As Maria locked up her office and headed home, she reflected on how much had changed since her encounter at the Chrome Diner just 4 days earlier. Jackson's casual dismissal seemed almost trivial now compared to the systemic challenges she was facing as commanding general. But, in some ways, that incident had prepared her for everything that followed. It reminded her that respect had to be earned through competence and character, not demanded through rank or position. It reinforced her understanding that changing attitudes required patience, persistence, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Maria Rodriguez was ready for both, armed with 20 years of experience and an unshakable belief that the military could be both excellent and inclusive, both effective and fair. The anonymous threats and subtle resistance she had already encountered were just the beginning. But they were also proof that her leadership mattered and that change was possible for those brave enough to pursue it. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and overcast, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the difficult conversation ahead. Maria sat in her office reviewing Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's personnel file one final time before their scheduled meeting. The picture that emerged was complex and troubling. Morrison's tactical competence was undeniable. His evaluation reports consistently praised his technical knowledge, training outcomes, and mission accomplishment. Superior officers described him as tactically brilliant, operationally focused, and devoted to excellence. His soldiers' performance in exercises and competitions had been outstanding under his leadership, but there were concerning patterns in the details. Equal opportunity complaints in his previous units had been consistently higher than average, though never quite high enough to trigger formal investigations. Retention rates among female and minority soldiers were significantly lower in units he had commanded. Several efficiency reports included subtle warnings disguised as neutral observations. One previous commander had written, "LTC Morrison maintains high standards and expects exceptional performance from all soldiers. His traditional approach to leadership produces excellent results, though some soldiers may require time to adapt to his expectations." Another had noted, "Morrison's unwavering commitment to proven methods ensures consistent outcomes, though he may benefit from exposure to diverse perspectives on modern leadership challenges." The coded language was familiar to Maria from her own experience navigating military bureaucracy. Morrison's superiors had recognized problems, but had chosen to manage rather than confront them, probably because his tactical results were too good to sacrifice for abstract concerns about inclusivity or morale. Major Chen knocked on the office door frame. "General, Colonel Morrison is here for his appointment." "Send him in, Sarah. And please hold my calls." Morrison entered wearing his dress uniform with every ribbon and badge precisely positioned. His posture was rigidly correct, his expression carefully neutral. He waited for permission to sit, then settled into the chair across from Maria's desk with the controlled movements of someone preparing for battle. "Colonel, thank you for taking time from your schedule," Maria began, her tone conversational rather than confrontational. "I wanted to discuss some observations from my visit to your battalion earlier this week." "Of course, General. I hope you were satisfied with what you saw. Your soldiers performed exceptionally well. Their tactical proficiency is obvious, and their dedication is commendable. You've clearly done excellent work preparing them for their mission." Morrison relaxed slightly, probably expecting the conversation to focus on technical matters where he felt confident and knowledgeable. "Thank you, ma'am. We take training seriously in 2nd Battalion." Maria leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "Colonel, I overheard part of your conversation with Major Torres on Tuesday afternoon. The one about implementing new regulations and policies." Morrison's face went pale, but he maintained his military bearing. "I see. May I ask what specifically you heard, General?" "Enough to understand that you believe regulations from higher headquarters are optional, depending on whether you agree with their purpose or intent." Maria kept her voice level and professional. "Would you like to explain your position?" For a long moment, Morrison said nothing. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully measured. "General, I believe my first responsibility is to maintain the combat readiness of my soldiers. Sometimes that means prioritizing proven methods over untested policies." "Are you suggesting that equal opportunity and anti-discrimination policies reduce combat effectiveness?" "I'm suggesting that when we spend more time focusing on social issues than combat skills, we weaken our ability to accomplish the mission. The enemy doesn't care about our diversity statistics." Maria had heard variations of this argument countless times throughout her career. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what made military units effective and how individual performance related to overall capability. "Colonel, let me share something I learned during my deployments. The most effective units were those where soldiers trusted their leaders and believed they were being treated fairly. Units with high levels of discrimination and exclusion consistently performed worse under pressure because they lacked internal cohesion." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, General, My unit's performance speaks for itself. We consistently score at the top in every evaluation. Training exercises are important, but they don't fully replicate the stress and complexity of real combat operations. When soldiers are fighting for their lives, they need to know that the person next to them will risk everything to protect them, regardless of gender, race, or any other factor. My soldiers would die for each other, Morrison insisted. I've built a brotherhood in that battalion. Some soldiers, perhaps. But what about the ones who don't quite fit the traditional mold? What about Sergeant Martinez and soldiers like her? Maria watched Morrison's reaction carefully. Do you think she feels like part of your brotherhood? Morrison's jaw tightened. Sergeant Martinez is an outstanding soldier. I've never treated her differently because she's a woman. Not treating someone differently isn't the same as fully accepting and supporting them. There's a difference between tolerance and genuine inclusion. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Major Chin entered with an apologetic expression. General, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Maria frowned. What kind of situation? There's been an incident at the Chrome Diner in Cedar Falls. The military police are requesting guidance on how to handle it. The mention of the Chrome Diner caught Maria's attention immediately. What happened? Apparently, some soldiers from the 82nd Airborne got into an altercation with local civilians. The owner is demanding that we take action, and the local police are involved. Maria felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. Which soldiers, Sarah? Chin consulted her notes. Sergeant Jackson and 3 others, all on weekend pass. They're currently being held at the local police station pending investigation. Morrison looked confused by the exchange. He had no idea about Maria's previous encounter at the diner, but he could sense that the situation had personal significance for his commanding general. Colonel, we'll need to continue this conversation later, Maria said, standing up. But let me be clear about one thing. The regulations and policies we discussed are not suggestions or guidelines. They are direct orders, and I expect them to be followed completely and enthusiastically. Yes, ma'am. I understand. I hope you do, because I'm going to be watching your unit very carefully over the coming weeks. I want to see evidence that every soldier feels valued and supported, regardless of their background. After Morrison left, Maria turned her attention to the situation in Cedar Falls. She asked Chun to gather all available information about the incident while she prepared for what would undoubtedly be a complicated and politically sensitive matter. The drive to Cedar Falls took 45 minutes, during which Maria received periodic updates via radio. The incident had apparently begun when Jackson and his friends returned to the Chrome Diner for dinner. According to witness statements, they had been drinking and were loud and disruptive from the moment they entered. The confrontation had escalated when Jackson made inappropriate comments to a female customer, a local teacher who was dining with her family. When her husband objected, Jackson became aggressive and threatened him. The situation had deteriorated rapidly, with other customers intervening and Jackson ultimately shoving an elderly veteran who had tried to calm things down. By the time local police arrived, the diner was in chaos. Jackson and his friends had barricaded themselves in the bathroom, claiming they were being persecuted for their military service. Other customers were angry and demanding arrests, while the diner owner was considering a ban on all military personnel. Maria arrived at the police station to find a crowd of angry civilians gathered outside, along with several news crews that had been alerted to the story. The optics were terrible, military soldiers causing trouble in a small town, potentially reinforcing negative stereotypes about young service members. Police Chief Robert Chun, no relation to Maria's aide, met her at the entrance. He was a veteran himself and seemed genuinely concerned about finding a solution that would satisfy everyone involved. General, I appreciate you coming down here personally. This is a delicate situation that could easily spiral out of control if we're not careful. What exactly happened, Chief? Chun provided a detailed account of the evening's events, based on witness statements and security camera footage from the diner. The story painted Jackson and his companions in an extremely unfavorable light: drunk, aggressive, and completely lacking in military bearing or civilian courtesy. The elderly gentleman they assaulted is Harold Peterson, a Korean War veteran. He was trying to de-escalate the situation when Sergeant Jackson shoved him to the ground. Peterson wasn't seriously hurt, but he's 82 years old and uses a walker. Maria felt sick to her stomach. The incident was exactly the kind of behavior that damaged the military's reputation and reinforced negative stereotypes about soldiers. It was also the logical extension of the attitudes she had witnessed from Jackson at the diner earlier that week. I want to speak with the soldiers first, then I'll talk to the injured parties and other witnesses. We need to make this right, Chief. Jackson and his 3 companions were being held in a conference room at the police station, where they had sobered up considerably from their earlier intoxication. When Maria entered the room, they immediately stood and attempted to come to attention, though their movements were unsteady and their uniforms disheveled. Sit down, Maria commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. All of you. Jackson was the first to speak, his voice shaky but still containing traces of his earlier arrogance. General, ma'am, there's been a misunderstanding. We were just having dinner when these civilians started harassing us for no reason. That's not what the witnesses say, Sergeant. That's not what the security cameras show, and that's not what the police report indicates. Maria's tone was ice cold. Would you like to try again? The other soldiers remained silent, clearly terrified by the situation they found themselves in. But Jackson seemed determined to maintain his innocence despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Ma'am, we may have had a few drinks, but we weren't causing any real trouble. These small-town people don't understand military culture. They took offense at things that are perfectly normal for soldiers. Maria stared at him for a long moment, remembering his casual dismissal of her at this same diner just 5 days earlier. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. The young sergeant who had treated her with such disrespect was now begging for her protection and intervention. Sergeant Jackson, do you remember being at the Chrome Diner last Sunday morning? Jackson looked confused by the question. Yes, ma'am. We stopped for breakfast on our way back from leave. Do you remember bumping into a civilian woman near your table? A woman you told to watch where she was going. Understanding began to dawn in Jackson's eyes, along with a growing sense of horror. Ma'am, I don't remember everyone I might have encountered. I remember, Sergeant. I remember very clearly. Maria's voice was quiet, but deadly serious. I also remember your comments about civilians not understanding military bearing and not serving their country. The room fell completely silent. Jackson's companions stared at him in shock, finally, understanding the full magnitude of their situation. They were not just in trouble with local police. They had personally insulted and disrespected their commanding general. General, if I said anything inappropriate. Jackson's voice trailed off as he realized there was no way to undo what had happened. You didn't just say something inappropriate, Sergeant. You demonstrated exactly the kind of attitude and behavior that damages the military's reputation and relationship with the civilian community we serve. Maria stood up, her posture radiating controlled anger. Tonight's incident is the logical result of the arrogance and entitlement you displayed last Sunday. She walked to the window, looking out at the crowd of angry civilians and news crews. Right now, there are people out there who are questioning whether soldiers can be trusted to behave responsibly in their community. There are veterans who feel ashamed to be associated with people who wear the same uniform they once wore with pride. Maria turned back to face the 4 soldiers, all of whom looked like they wanted to disappear. You have damaged the reputation of every soldier on this base and every veteran in this town. You have reinforced negative stereotypes and made my job infinitely more difficult. Jackson finally found his voice again, though it was barely above a whisper. General, what can we do to make this right? First, you're going to face the full consequences of your actions under both civilian and military law. Second, you're going to personally apologize to every person you wronged, starting with Mr. Peterson. Third, you're going to spend the next several months learning what it really means to serve with honor and integrity. Maria outlined the disciplinary process that would follow, including reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and extensive community service. But, more importantly, she explained how their behavior reflected broader problems with military culture that needed to be addressed systematically. The military exists to serve the people of this nation, not to lord our authority over them. We are guests in civilian communities, and we must earn their trust and respect through our actions, not demand it through our position. After dealing with the soldiers, Maria spent 2 hours meeting with the victims and witnesses of the evening's incident. She listened to their concerns, apologized for the soldiers' behavior, and worked with Chief Chun to develop a plan for making amends to the community. Harold Peterson, the elderly veteran who had been assaulted, was gracious despite his obvious anger and disappointment. "General, I served with pride for 4 years. These boys don't represent the military I knew and loved. But they could, if someone teaches them what service really means." His words hit Maria harder than any criticism could have. Peterson understood that Jackson and his friends weren't inherently bad soldiers. They were young men who had been allowed to develop toxic attitudes that went unchecked and uncorrected. The conversation with the female teacher and her family was equally difficult. They had been celebrating their daughter's birthday when Jackson's inappropriate comments and aggressive behavior had ruined their evening. The father, a mild-mannered accountant named Mike Russell, was particularly upset. "General, my daughter asked me tonight why those soldiers were so mean. How do I explain to an 8-year-old that people who are supposed to protect us can also be the ones who make us feel unsafe?" Maria had no easy answer for that question. She could only promise that the military would take responsibility for its failures and work to ensure that similar incidents didn't happen again. The drive back to Fort Hamilton gave her time to process everything that had happened. The incident at the Chrome Diner was a stark reminder of how individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for military-civilian relations and public trust. But it was also an opportunity to address deeper cultural problems that had been festering unchecked. Jackson's behavior was extreme, but the attitudes that led to it were more widespread than many leaders wanted to acknowledge. Back in her office, Maria called Lieutenant Colonel Morrison to inform him about the incident and its implications for his unit's culture and leadership. She also scheduled additional meetings with other battalion commanders to discuss expectations and accountability measures. The anonymous, threatening message she had received after her change of command ceremony suddenly made more sense. There were people in her organization who shared Jackson's attitudes about civilian authority, equal treatment, and military superiority. Changing those attitudes would require sustained effort and unwavering commitment. But Maria had not come this far by backing down from difficult challenges. The incident at the Chrome Diner had crystallized her understanding of what needed to be changed and why it mattered. Tomorrow would begin the hard work of transforming not just policies and procedures, but hearts and minds. As she prepared to leave her office, Major Chin knocked on the door with a final report from the Cedar Falls Police. "General, Chief Chin wanted you to know that the local news coverage has been surprisingly balanced. They're focusing on your response and the military's commitment to accountability rather than just sensationalizing the incident. That's something, at least." Maria gathered her papers and headed for the door. "Sarah, I want you to set up a meeting with all senior NCOs next week. It's time for some very honest conversations about leadership and standards." The next phase of her command would be defined by how well she could transform the lessons of this crisis into lasting institutional change. It would not be easy, but it was necessary. The alternative was accepting that incidents like this were inevitable rather than preventable. Maria Rodriguez had become a general not just to command soldiers, but to lead them toward becoming the kind of people the nation deserved to have defending it. The work started now. 6 months after the incident at the Chrome Diner, Maria stood before a packed auditorium at Fort Hamilton delivering her keynote address to the Army Leadership Symposium. Military leaders from across the country had come to hear about the transformation that had taken place under her command and the lessons learned from turning crisis into opportunity. The auditorium was filled with generals, colonels, and senior sergeants major, all eager to understand how Fort Hamilton had become a model for cultural change within the military. Behind Maria on the stage sat several of her key leaders, including Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, whose own transformation had become a central part of the base's success story. "Leadership," Maria began, "is not about commanding from a position of authority. It's about inspiring change from a foundation of trust and respect. 6 months ago, This base faced a crisis that forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about military culture and civilian relations. She clicked to the first slide, which showed statistics comparing Fort Hamilton's performance before and after the implementation of new leadership initiatives.